Hello and welcome to another Jog Vlogs for the topic of weather hazards and climate change. This session is going to be finishing off the weather hazard that is tropical cyclones. So today we're going to be looking at a comparison between two specific case studies of tropical cyclone events. In this session we're going to be looking at a case study for a developed country, so how a developed country has been affected by a tropical cyclone, but also an emerging country. So we're going to get the chance to basically compare the impacts and how different areas of the world, depending on their level of development, can deal with hurricane events or tropical cyclone events. So write the title down for today, please, and I'll explain what we're going to be doing for the remainder of the session. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go over the homework which I set you, which was, I say homework, the task I asked you to do in the lesson last time, which was to give you a list of hurricanes in 2005. So these hurricanes affected lots of parts of the Caribbean and the United States of America, because they are hurricanes. You can see it was a bumpy year for those tropical cyclone events. So what I asked you to do to start with is to colour code those tropical cyclones according to whether they were category 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 hurricanes. And if they didn't meet the requirements for at least category 1, just leave them blank. So you can see there are quite a few category 1 hurricanes. You've got Cindy and Nate, Ophelia, Philippe, Stan, Vince and Epsilon. And you've also got just one category 2 hurricane in Irene. Then you've got a couple of 3s, Maria and Beta. Then you've got 1-4 in Dennis. And then finally 4 category 5 hurricanes, Emily, Katrina, Rita and Wilma. And all of those category 5 hurricanes were really quite damaging. Now there were questions attached to that, and I've provided you with the answers on the left hand side here. So for task 3, I wanted you to essentially do a bit more with this data. So it says overall there's a trend that suggests the category 4 and 5 are the most damaging, and 5 of the 6 most financially damaging hurricanes were very much also had the highest deaths as well in 2005. So yes, category 4 and 5 are often the most damaging. That is absolutely true to say. Hurricane Katrina, category 5, was the most damaging and it caused the most deaths, so it was the most expensive and the most highest death toll. Hurricane Rita and Wilma, they caused high amounts of damage as well, 12 billion, 29.4 billion respectively, so quite, again, a great amount of damage caused by those hurricanes. But it's not always the case, and I mentioned this actually in the session. Hurricane Stan, category 1, 4th highest damage cost and 2nd greatest death toll. So again, the reasons for that might be that it hit a country that had just been hit by another hurricane or a difficult hurricane. So after Rita, maybe that kind of created damage which, just in the space of about another week, because that's really when Stan hit, in the space of another week, they hadn't managed to repair it or recover it in time, and so Stan came along and just really kind of put the nail in the coffin for a lot of people trying to recover from Hurricane Rita. So again, it led to a greater number of deaths than you might have experienced, because maybe people's homes were destroyed, but maybe they didn't die in Rita. And then when Stan came along, they were homeless, they didn't have a chance to rebuild. It doesn't take a week to build a house, it takes much longer. So they were maybe more exposed when Stan hit. That could be one of the reasons. Okay, so that summarises the homework. Now, the task that you're going to be completing today is going to be fairly independent, but with a bit of input from me. But essentially, I want you to produce one-sided summary of both Hurricane Sandy and Typhoon Haiyan. So they were two very damaging hurricanes or tropical cyclones. Okay, one of them was a hurricane, the other one was a typhoon. Again, so you can tell me where these two places were, or these two tropical cyclone events occurred. You should be able to anyway. But one of them specifically is something that affected the USA. So Hurricane Sandy affected the United States of America, particularly New York City, and it is a wealthier, more developed country. Whereas Typhoon Haiyan affected the Philippines, which is a far less developed country with greater levels of poverty, deprivation, less kind of systems in place. So you are comparing just essentially the causes, the size, but also the impacts and responses, more importantly, of both. Now, I'm not saying that one was better than the other. What I am saying is that they are different. So you might find, for example, that in Hurricane Sandy, the financial damage was much higher, whereas in Typhoon Haiyan, it would have been the human death toll that was much higher. Again, that tells you a lot about the country's ability to cope with these particular disasters. Also, the way in which the responses occurred for Hurricane Sandy will differ from those of Typhoon Haiyan. So the USA, very wealthy country, able to kind of help itself, whereas Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines needed a bit more outside help. So we're going to compare them. And the A3 sheet, you don't need to structure yourself. I've already provided that for you. So look at, obviously this is a summary of what you need to produce. So you can always go back to this by going back in the video. But this is a summary of specifically what I want you to include. So it needs location detail. Again, one sentence with a map. We're not going to bang on about location detail because truthfully you're not going to get a big question on it. A background, to the tropical cyclone event. So the name of the cyclone, the year, the dates, all the places affected. It might have been several countries. For example, in Hurricane Sandy, several countries were affected. Wind speed, so essentially like a fact file. Then we're starting to focus on the impacts. Now this is where the detail needs to increase. So I'd like you to give me social impacts of Sandy and Haiyan. So social impacts, things like death, effect on education, infrastructure like roads and railways and airports, things like that. Economic impacts are effects on money and jobs. And lastly, the environmental impacts are things that affected the environment, so habitats and species. So you need to try and categorize the impacts into those three categories. And the reason I'm doing those three categories, because the exam board used those three categories. Now, if that's the case, you wait, and this, more often than not, this or the drought one is where the 8-mark question comes from. So they will specify in their particular question, it might say, assess the economic impacts of a tropical cyclone event in a developed country, in which case you need to focus on the economic parts of Hurricane Sandy. It might say look at the social impacts of a hurricane or a tropical cyclone in an emerging or developing country, in which case you look at the impacts of Typhoon Haiyan. But you also need to know how they responded to the events, and those responses need to look at like the long-term response and the short-term immediate responses, because again you could easily be asked to evaluate or assess the responses to a named tropical cyclone or tropical hurricane event. So this is really important. The detail that you produce here is critical, and I would say I would spend a good full hour producing this. If you don't use a full hour, it's going to be questionable whether you've put the detail in. Okay, so the handout that you're going to use is this, and I've very handily given a map for you to look at, so you can see geographically where it was, when it became a super typhoon. You can also look at the impacts, and you can bullet point social, economic, environmental. So I've tried to categorize it for you. You just have to work out which goes where. And the responses, again, is space for the responses. Now this is an A3 sheet on 365. You can either print it out or you can just follow this structure and complete it in your book. But again, detail is absolutely critical. Don't write big and just brief bullet points. I want detailed information here, because this could easily be, and often is, where the 8-mark question comes from. So please make sure you've got lots and lots of notes, because this really is important stuff. Now, resources. First and foremost, the Highland Cow textbook provides you with lots of good stuff. Page 110, 113 will give you lots of detail about the different tropical cyclone events. I would also suggest adding to that, because some of the work in the book is a bit brief sometimes. You've got the internet. Just make sure you've got the right year and you've got the right name, but there's loads of detail. Don't copy and paste it. Read it, work out if it's an impact, a response, or whatever, and then just fill in the blanks. Okay. It says use last year's work, but I'm not going to provide you access to last year's work, so you're going to have to leave that one. Ignore the thing that says assessment sheet. And there is a Hurricane Sandy BBC documentary, but I would say use the first two, Highland Cow, internet, to complete your sheets, and then watch the Hurricane Sandy BBC documentary, because I've got that available for you to use, available for you to access in the Jog Vlogs folder. and also a YouTube link that's on this PowerPoint as well if you want to use that instead. And it says you've got 2 weeks plus homework to complete your assessment. I would actually say you've got a lesson and a half. So if you're doing this at home, you need to really spend the time doing this. Ignore the documentary until you've completed all the notes, because that is the most important thing you have. So good luck with it. Use the resources available. If you get stuck, give us a shout. And then when you're ready, you can unpause the screen and I'll show you the link to the YouTube documentary, or the video documentary that's a BBC documentary about Hurricane Sandy. I promise you, even if you don't add to your notes, it's worth watching because it's a very interesting example of a hurricane, because it behaved in a slightly unusual way. Alright, so good luck with your information. Again, you can always go back to this if you want to see what's in what, but this sheet should guide you through, and use all the resources you can to produce a detailed overview of these 2 different hurricane events or tropical cyclone events. And look, while you're doing it, try and notice the differences. Try and see how the social impacts vary from Sandy to Haiyan. Try and look at how the responses vary from Sandy to Haiyan. Alright, and as promised, this link will take you to, if it still works, and there should be an underscore there, a BBC documentary about Hurricane Sandy. And if you can't access that, then I think I've downloaded that for the Job Logs folder for educational purposes. So that actually finishes the tropical cyclones aspect of the weather hazards and climate change topic. We've got one more weather hazard to look at, which is drought, and we're going to start looking at that next lesson. So thank you very much for listening. Good luck with the producing the handout of comparison of the 2 case studies, and I'll see you next time.